Today we are at our 125th reading. We've got 2 Samuel chapter 10. We have 1 Chronicles chapter 20, Psalms 20, and Matthew 22. Now, David finds out that one of his neighbors is grieving. He sends condolences, and his servants are humiliated. So armies form up, and everyone goes to battle, and David wins. He routs the other armies. He gains vassals, meaning they are subservient groups of people now that have to send tribute or tax to David. So they are not like a full member of David's nation state, but David gets resources from them and builds up his wealth and his influence. When we go to 1 Chronicles 20, there's another version of the battles. One thing I want you to notice here is it starts by saying in the spring when kings usually go off to war. This reminds us that contextually, spring was the time that nation states went to war. Part of this was weather. Part of it was when do the rains come? When it is muddy? When can we move an army? Part of it was you can't send the army off until you get the crops in the ground. They can go battle each other and then they come back in the fall to harvest the crops. And so there is some rhythm and routine to the schedule of life. They're not always at war back then. But I want you to remember this statement when we get to the story of Bathsheba in a little bit, because we're going to hear again in the spring when kings usually go off to war, and it's going to have an impact on the story of David and Bathsheba. The text, again, this whole area is elevating David. It's showing his success. It's showing the growth of the kingdom. This was a huge deal in this time period because kingdoms and dynasties were by bloodline. And so you want to make sure that everyone understands that the person in charge has a hereditary and a divinely ordained reason for being in charge. If we look at the dynasties of Egypt, sometimes they switched dynasties, switched bloodlines, and some of the new pharaohs would actually go and tear down the old pharaohs' temples. They would bury them in the sand so they were completely forgotten. We have some pharaohs that we are just learning about now because we are just finding on digging up their temples now. So sometimes the pharaohs did an amazing job erasing the even existence of previous pharaohs that were from different bloodlines. So a lot of what we're reading here in 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles is trying to make a really strong case that David is connected to God. God smiles upon David, likes David, and is blessing David. And David is the rightful king of Israel at this time, and that any children, grandchildren of David will be rightful leaders for the nation of Israel. Psalm 20 is connected to all of this. It is a prayer before battle. So it sounds very much like the sort of thing that people would be praying for David to be blessed as he was leading them into battle. One thing to notice, though, that scholars have looked very carefully at this and realized that it sounds an awful lot like a prayer to the god Horus from ancient Egypt. And they've been doing some more research, and they've actually found an even older version of this prayer to the god Baal. And so it seems that there's some copying of prayers going on around, and then they're just putting a different God's name in there. But again, this prayer, this psalm is emphasizing the divine presence being with the king, and that the divine presence is what really brings success, not pure military might. In Matthew, we are getting some of the final teachings of Jesus before he goes to the cross. We have the wedding banquet story, which makes us question who are the guests that God is inviting to the party, and who shows up and who doesn't show up. I think when God invites us to be part of his kingdom, a lot of us are like, I'm busy. I don't have time for this. I've got to get to Little League practice. I've got to work, and then I'm going fishing. I've got to spend time with my wife. There's all sorts of excuses that we don't fit time for God into our lives. And sometimes we even beat up God's messengers when they do come to remind us to make a little time for God in our lives. Then we have a paying taxes story, and Jesus again kind of trips up the people who are trying to trip him up. He's like, "Hey, look at the coin. Whose picture's on it? It's Caesar's coin. Well, it must be Caesar's money, so give it back to Caesar," which of course really outsmarts his enemies. Doesn't exactly help him win friends with this. Then we have a story about Sadducees asking a question about marriage and death. Sadducees are a group of religious leaders, but they're people who do not believe in the resurrection. So some people in the Jewish tradition believe in a life after death, some do not. The Sadducees do not. So they are trying to trip Jesus up with a question about marriage and death. Jesus kind of does an end run around him, but I think he says something very important for us to remember today with some of the conversations we have about life and death. And that is that God is the God of the living, not the God of the dead. For a lot of us, we are in Christian traditions who have put a huge amount of emphasis on the afterlife. What happens when we die? Do we go to heaven? Do we go to hell? What if Jesus and God are putting a greater emphasis on their relationship with us right here, right now, in our regular life? You know, Jesus is often talking about God's kingdom in the present tense, not the future tense of someplace far off at some point in the future. Jesus wants to build up God's kingdom here today. Jesus calls us to be working with Jesus right now to make the world a better place. This leads to verses 37 to 40, which are often called the greatest commandment. Love God with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. This covers all of the law and the prophets. And then we have verse 45, and it really seems like Jesus is stomping on the people who are trying to read Holy Scriptures literally. And we really end up wondering, how are we to be reading and applying the Bible? And in our Methodist tradition, we take the Bible as the primary source material, but we know, as we've talked about, there's some inconsistencies. Sometimes God changes God's mind. Sometimes Jesus comes and clarify things in new ways. And so we take the Bible as the primary authority, but then we also use the reason, the brain God gave us to think logically. We use tradition of the believers who've gone before us and the churches that have stood the test of time, but have sometimes needed to make adjustments because they've kind of gotten stuck in tradition along the way. And then our experience, and we put all of those things together to have a better understanding of what God is doing. So for us, it's not only the Bible, but it is the Bible plus reason and experience and tradition. So we will continue wrestling with the Word of God and seeing where God is challenging us to grow and stretch and find new ways to love both God and neighbor in our daily life. We'll see you next time.